Okay, hey, hello everybody. How are you? Uh, Welcome to tonight's edition of the coronavirus and the Spanish flu epidemic, a comparison, multidisciplinary social science approach to a comparison of it. Tonight I got a little bit of a treat for you. Last night I had talked about the history of the Spanish flu epidemic and how it had affected the world in 1918 in brief in general, talked about a couple of the conspiracy theories about its beginnings, and talked about what the historical evidence actually provides as to its possible beginnings. Tonight I'm going to show you a little bit of a documentary from PBS from a show called The American Experience. You could probably look it up and watch it on your own if you wanted, and it's called The Influenza Epidemic of 1918. There was a children's rhyme back then that always sticks in my mind, and Woodrow Wilson actually quoted it when he was asked about sending troops to the World War I who may be infected with it. And he said, have you heard the little children's limerick they're singing while they skip rope? It goes, I had a little birdie. His name was Enza. I opened up the window and influenza. You can kind of get the pun there. So I'm going to pull up the, if I can find where it is here. I'm not sure if that's it or not. Hopefully it is. It is. Okay, good. All right, so we're just going to watch the first half of this tonight. It's about 50 minutes long, so we'll get in half tonight, half tomorrow night, and then certainly we'll have a discussion about it. But this is just a little bit more of the history there regarding 1918 influenza. Before we do that, I do want to go up here, and I think I'm going to optimize that so you guys can see. We'll resume the share. I don't know what I'm doing here. This did work earlier, so screen sharing is paused. Okay. All right, I apologize for this. We're gonna hopefully get this figured out here. Okay, that's not what I want. I think this is what I want. Okay, I'll just start playing it now and hopefully you can see it. If you can't see this, shoot me a message if you would, please, to let me know that this isn't working for you.
People didn't want to believe that they could be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall. They didn't want to believe that.
It was the worst epidemic this country has ever known. It killed more Americans than all the wars this century combined.
It was a phantom, and we didn't know where it was.
In a gradual, remorseless way, it kept moving closer and closer.
You never knew from day to day who was going to be next on the death list.
There were so many people dying that you ran out of things that you'd never considered running out of before, caskets.
Before it was over, it almost broke America apart.
I remember my mother putting a white sheet, a white piece of cloth over his face, and they closed the casket.
In 1918, the United States was a vigorous young nation, leading the world into the modern age. All our fears and anxieties were directed toward Europe, where the war raged. At home, we were safe. William Maxwell was growing up in Lincoln, Illinois.
In 1918, Lincoln was a town of 12,000 people. It was perhaps 50 years old, just time enough for the trees to mature so that the branches met over the sidewalks. Yards were large and children played in clusters in the summer evenings. On Sunday morning, the church bells were pretty to hear, but my father had had enough of church going, so we went fishing on Sunday out in the country with a picnic. It was a life not very much impinged on by the outside world.
In Macon, Georgia, Catherine Guyler was 5 years old.
My father was a playmate, actually, and when he'd take me out in his car, he would stop at a grocery store that he knew and take me in, and the owner of the store, in his white uniform, would say to his men, "Go out and shake the candy tree, boys." I think I must have known that candy didn't grow on that tree, but I wouldn't have given up the notion because he was enjoying it, and I was enjoying it, and everybody was enjoying it, you see.
For a young newspaper woman in Denver, Catherine Ann Porter, life was like a romantic novel.
I had a job on the Rocky Mountain News. The city editor put me to covering theaters. I met a boy, an Army lieutenant. We were much in love.
The soldier was the darling of America. Patriotism ran unrestrained in a country newly entered in the Great War.
We would march up the streets singing "Tramp, tramp, tramp, the boys are marching." I spied Kaiser at the door, and we'll get a lemon pie and we'll squash him in his eye, and there won't be any Kaiser anymore.
It was a good world, but it was an age of innocence. We really didn't know what was ahead.
Some say it began in the spring of 1918, when soldiers at Fort Riley, Kansas, burned tons of manure. A gale kicked up. A choking dust storm swept out over the land. A stinging, stinking yellow haze. The sun went dead black in Kansas. 2 days later, on March 11th, 1918, an Army private reported to the camp hospital before breakfast. He had a fever, sore throat, headache, nothing serious. 1 minute later, another soldier showed up. By noon, the hospital had over 100 cases. In a week, 500. That spring, 48 soldiers, all in the prime of life, died at Fort Riley. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia. The sickness then seemed to disappear, leaving as quickly as it had come. For over a century, the booming science of medicine had gone from one triumph to another. Researchers had developed vaccines for many diseases: smallpox, anthrax, rabies, diphtheria, meningitis.
With the great advances in microbiology, we were eliminating mysteries, okay? The mystery of what causes this disease, the mystery of what causes this disease. The optimism of being able to visualize something, all we have to do is just look under the microscope and we'll see the organism and then take an action and see that something die off or be controlled. That leads to the thought of invincibility.
It seemed that the masters of medicine could control life and death. There was nothing that Americans couldn't do. We could even win the war that no one could win. That summer and fall, over 1.5 million Americans crossed the Atlantic for war. But some of those doughboys came from Kansas, and they'd brought something with them, a tiny, silent companion. Almost immediately, the Kansas sickness resurfaced in Europe. American soldiers got sick, English soldiers, French, German. As it spread, the microbe mutated, day by day, becoming more and more deadly. By the time the silent traveler came back to America, it had become a relentless killer. On a rainy day in September, Dr. Victor Vaughan, acting Surgeon General of the Army, received urgent orders. Proceed to a base near Boston called Camp Devens. Devens was about to change Dr. Vaughan's world forever.
I saw hundreds of young, stalwart men in uniform coming into the wards of the hospital. Every bed was full, yet others crowded in. The faces wore a bluish cast. A cough brought up the blood-stained sputum.
On the day that Vaughan arrived, 63 men died at Camp Devens. An autopsy revealed lungs that were swollen, filled with fluid, and strangely blue. Doctors were stunned. What in the name of God was happening to these lungs? When the strange new disease was finally identified, it turned out to be a very old and familiar one: influenza, the flu. But it was unlike any flu that anyone had ever seen.
One of the factors that made this so particularly frightening was that everybody had a preconception of what the flu was. It's a miserable cold, and after a few days you're up and around. This was a flu that put people into bed as if they'd been hit with a 2x4, that turned into pneumonia, that turned people blue and black and killed them. It was a flu out of some sort of a horror story. They never had dreamed that influenza could ever do anything like this to people before.
Soldiers carried the disease swiftly from one military base to the next. They did it just by breathing.
If an individual with influenza were standing in front of a room full of people, coughing, each cough would carry millions of particles with disease-causing organisms into the air. All the people breathing that air would have an opportunity to inhale a disease-causing organism. It doesn't take very long for one case to become 10,000 cases.
My first intimations about the epidemic were that it was something that was happening to the troops. There didn't seem to be any reason to think that it would ever have anything to do with us. And yet, in a gradual, remorseless way, it kept moving closer and closer.
For a time, life in America went on untouched. Suffragettes demanded the vote for women. Airmail service began zooming between New York and Chicago. Flying time, 10 hours, 5 minutes. On September 11th, Babe Ruth led the Boston Red Sox to victory in the World Series. But on that same day, on the sidewalks of Quincy, Massachusetts, 3 civilians dropped dead. Influenza was out in the world. From Boston, the disease moved down the eastern seaboard to New York, to Philadelphia, and beyond.
Rumors of this alarming situation had reached this very small town of 12,000 people in the Middle West. I know that my parents were worried. I paid less attention to their words than I did to the sounds of their voices, and when they discussed it, I heard anxiety. My mother was expecting a baby, and so my father and mother had no choice but to take me to my father's sister's house, where we were not comfortable. It was a dark, gloomy house. I can best suggest the quality of the house by saying in the living room there was a framed photograph of my grandfather in his coffin. It was a very strange room. There was a vase with peacock feathers in it. And my aunt didn't know, I don't know that anybody else in Lincoln knew, that peacock feathers bring bad luck.
The first time that I was aware that something was amiss in our normal living was when my father told me, son, most of the employees are sick. We don't have anyone left to run the store. Everyone is homesick or in the hospital sick. And within a week or 10 days, my father told me that this sales lady had passed away and another one had passed away. So as I recall, out of the 8 or 10 employees, 4 of them passed away, and the passing away came about so quickly.
It was a mild day, and we were sitting on a step. Diagonally across from us, there was a girl, 15-year-old girl, was just buried. Towards the evening, we heard a lot of screaming going on. And in that same house, a little baby, 18 months old, passed away. In that same family.
For a physician, it must have been very, very confusing, being confronted with patients that come to you and within 12 hours, before you even have a chance to do anything, they're dead. This was happening too fast.
Even children began to see it coming. A little ditty was heard in playgrounds.
I had a little bird. Its name was Enza. I opened the window and influenza. I had a little bird. Its name was Enza. I opened the window and
Most officials, however, failed to recognize the growing threat. Royal Copeland, health commissioner of New York City, announced, "The city is in no danger of an epidemic. No need for our people to worry." Copeland would let things take their own course.
The first reaction of the authorities, for many of the most important ones, was just flat-out denial. They didn't know what was happening, they didn't know what to do, and therefore they did the human thing, which is to say it's not happening.
With the war escalating, federal officials continued to put Americans at risk. One September day, they called 13 million young men to register for the draft. The men jammed together in schoolhouses, city halls, post offices.
There were two enormously important things going on at once, and they were at right angles to each other. One, of course, was the influenza epidemic, which dictated that you should sort of shut everything down, and the war, which demanded that everything should speed up, that certainly the factories should continue operating, you should continue to have bond drives, soldiers should be put on boats and sent off to France. It's as if we could, as a society, only contain one big idea at a time, and the big idea was the war.
With America's tunnel vision focused on the war, throngs turned out for enormous parades supporting Liberty Loan drives. In Philadelphia, 200,000 sardined in the streets. The crowd linked arms, sang patriotic songs, breathed on each other, infected each other. And in the days that followed, The flu ripped into Philadelphia like a freshly sharpened knife. Harriet Farrell's family lived on Brooklyn Street.
It was really a terrible experience for the people. There was so many people sick. In our household, it was the 4 of us in bed, and my uncle and aunt on the 3rd floor apartment with their son. So my mother was caring for 7 sick people in our home.
When my mother became ill, that's when I knew we were in trouble. I only knew it from my child's eye. And my child's eye was 5 years old. I wanted to go and get in her bed, and it wasn't allowed. They didn't want me to get sick either, do you see? And they brought in a little bed into her room. My mother saw me miserable in that little bed that they brought in for me and tucked me in her bed because she didn't like to see me unhappy. And of course, I promptly got the flu with her, as you can imagine. And there was fun in that for me until it became so painful.
I was a skinny little boy with an enormous appetite. Just as my plate was put in front of me, I felt no desire for food. My aunt put her hand on my forehead and got up from the table and took me upstairs and put me to bed because I had a high fever. And I think what happened was that I slept and slept and slept and slept.
No one knew what was causing the epidemic, but there was no shortage of guesses.
There were rumors that ran rampant of all types and sizes. And one of the rumors I remember very explicitly was that the Germans had planted the germs for the spread of influenza.
Flamboyant evangelist Billy Sunday thought the cause was as simple as sin. "We can meet here tonight and pray down the epidemic," Sunday said. But even as he spoke, people in the audience collapsed with the flu. One agonized official in the stricken East sent an urgent warning west. "Hunt up your woodworkers and set them to making coffins. Then take your street laborers and set them to digging graves." The flu was now moving into small towns, deep in the heart of the country. Lee Ray was living in Meadow, Utah.
We were very concerned in our town because it was moving south down the highway, and we were next. My father was selected as the health officer. We had never had a health officer in our town before, but we felt now that we needed one, and so my dad went out to the city limit signs, and I went with him, and we put a sign that said, "This town is quarantined, do not stop." So we had purposely isolated ourselves, but it wasn't enough. The disease came anyway. The mailman brought it.
You can't barrier yourself from being exposed because the person who looks healthy may be spreading the disease. And that was part of the horror. We can't get away from respiratory diseases of other people because we all have to breathe.
In Denver, Catherine Ann Porter's romance was cut short. She too became sick. Soon she was delirious. But Porter's dashing young lieutenant stayed by her side.
He was so patient with me, those nights when I was sick, getting me things, and always just sitting there. When I would wake up, he would be there.
Her fever rose so high that her hair turned white, then fell out.
There was only that pain, only that room. There was only this one moment, and it was a dream of time.
I remember that time was a blur as I was lying in that little upstairs room, and I would wake up and it would be daylight, and I'd wake up, the next time I woke up it would be dark. And it might be dark when I woke up, it might be daylight. I had no sense of day and night, and I felt sick and hollow inside.
And influenza. I had a little bird. His name was Enza. I opened the window.
And influenza. Hospitals overflowed. Emergency relief centers sprang up in parks and playgrounds. But practically every available doctor and nurse had been sent to Europe. The ones who remained were asked to perform the impossible. Near Chicago, a young nurse named Josie Mabel Brown arrived at Great Lakes Naval Station and was promptly assigned a ward with 42 beds.
And she walked into the ward, and not only were the 42 beds full, but there were boys that were laying on the floors and on the stretchers, waiting for that boy in the bed to die. They were having raging fevers and delirium and profuse nosebleeds, and their lungs would collapse, and it would go into this horrid bloody pneumonia.
When the 1918 flu killed, which it so often did, it killed because of what it did to the lungs. It filled up the lungs with fluid, and so these people drowned. Only they didn't drown in the Atlantic Ocean; they drowned in their own fluids.
Okay, I think that's where I'm going to stop it today. I hope everybody was able to hear it okay. Cole, were you able to hear it okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And Sarah, were you able to hear it okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to stop it there today. What do you guys think so far? Do you see any similarities between what's happening there and what's going on now?
I would say definitely, and even in the ways that they're trying to, like, I don't know, help cure it, like how they were setting up tents and test stations in parks and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, that's really.
Yeah, definitely. It's something you can see today that, Governor Pritzker goes out and asks retired doctors and nurses, please come back to work. We need you because we have this shortage. And of course, their shortage was due to the war. Ours is probably more of a supply and demand thing and the cost of medical care and to get a medical education. But certainly, with this shortage of doctors and nurses happening and begging people to come back, to come help with this.
Yeah.
All right. We'll keep those in mind. We're going to finish watching this tomorrow. We won't have any class Friday. When we come back Monday, we'll start talking about what was the government's reaction at the time and go through the history of that compared to the government's reaction today, and maybe talk about some of the political and legal hurdles, the constitutional hurdles to handling a pandemic like this, and kind of get into the political science realm of the social science of comparing and looking at these things. So do you guys have any other questions? Hey, I hope you're all, okay, well, hope you all are doing well. If you need anything, again, please feel free to contact me, and hopefully you come back tomorrow night to watch the end of it. I'll see you guys later.
Thank you.
Yep.
See ya.
Okay. See ya.